Hi, hope you're doing good. Hope also you did great in the midterm, and welcome to our new lecture together, Lecture 11. Today we're going to discuss part of the thinkers, philosophers, and the most important thinkers in dealing with political science and dealing with the core principles of political science. As we said before, each science is an accumulative efforts by many thinkers, philosophers, and people who studied the sector. And it is the same with political science. That's why we're going to discuss part of the thinkers who started to talk about political science from their own perspective. Montesquieu is one of these thinkers. So let's start with Montesquieu. Montesquieu is a French political theorist who started to talk about political science since he started to discuss any other thoughts or concepts. Through his work and literature, he wrote a very important book. He called it The Spirit of Laws. During this book, he was really influenced by many other thinkers from his era. A very important point here that he was strongly influenced his younger contemporary Rousseau. Rousseau also is one of the most important politicians who talked about political science, a lot of phenomena and aspects of politics. He's also influenced by many other thinkers, especially from the American literature or the American track, especially John Adams and others like Madison. What did he started to talk about? Actually, he rejected Aristotle's classification for political science. Montesquieu distinguished between three ideal types of government. Number one, monarchy, in which a single person governs by fixed and established law. Despotism, in which a single person directs everything by his own will and interest. Number three, Republican or popular government, upon his definition, in which may be of two types, depending on whether the body or only a part of people is possessed of the supreme power. The former being a democracy, the later as aristocratic system. So, what we need to talk about here is that Montesquieu is one of these who started to talk about democracy, but in a very maybe simple way. According to Montesquieu, a necessary condition for the existence of a republican government, whether democratic or aristocratic, is that the people in whom supreme power is controlled or possess the quality of public virtue, meaning that they are motivated by a desire to achieve the public good. And this is one of the most important terms in political science. What does public good mean? And how this could be achieved, and how we might create a balance between the public good and the individual interests. Again, according to Montesquieu, this is the core criteria to say whether this is a country or community will go for a democratic track or not. Although public virtue may not be necessary in a monarchy and is certainly absent in despotic regimes, it must be present to some degree in aristocratic republic, and to a large degree in democratic republics. Sounding a theme that will be loudly echoed in Madison's and Montesquieu literature, asserting that without strong republic virtue, a democratic republic is likely to be destroyed by conflict between various factions, each pursuing its own narrow interests and the expense of broader public good. So this again, creating the balance as the key, as the important um, controlling key to go for a democratic community. Okay, after we talked about Montesquieu, it's the time to talk about another important philosopher and another important thinker who's Hobbes. Also is another important philosopher who started to talk about political science and discussed many aspects of political science, and he tried to explain many phenomena in political science. According to him, the destructive power of factions was also strongly emphasized by the Scotch philosopher and politician David Hume, whose influence on Madison was perhaps even greater than Montesquieu himself. For it was from Hume that Madison seems to have acquired a view about factions that turned the issue of the desirability of larger political association, for example, those larger than the city-state, on its head, for the purpose of diminishing the destructive potential of factionalism. So Home and Madison argued bigger, in fact better, because in bigger associations, each representative must look after a greater diversity of interests. It is also likely that Madison was influenced by him when Friedrich Stern, who rejected the term democracy for the type of government based on representation, preferring instead to call it republic. So here again, it is how they see things, how they illustrate things based on their experience, perspective, and social context. Rousseau is one of the most famous, important politicians, thinkers, philosophers who ever participated in shaping political science from the beginning. When comparing what all the philosophers started and established and contributed, Rousseau is one of the most remarkable ones. When compared with Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau sometimes seems the more radical democratic, though a close reading of his work shows that, in important respects, Rousseau's concept of democracy is narrower than Locke's. Indeed, in his most influential work of political philosophy, which called The Social Contract, Rousseau asserts that democracy is compatible with representative institutions, a position that renders it all but relative to nation states. The sovereignty of the people, he argues, can be neither alienated nor represented. The idea of representatives is modern, he wrote. In ancient republics, the people never had representatives. The moment a people allow itself to be represented, it is no longer free. It no longer exists. But if representation is incompatible with democracy, and if direct democracy is the only legitimate form of government, then no nation state of Rousseau's time or any other can have legitimate government. Furthermore, according to Rousseau, if a political association that is small enough to practice direct democracy, such city-state, for example, were to come into existence, it would inevitably be subjected and subjugated by larger nation states and thereby case to be democratic. For these and other reasons, Rousseau was a little bit pessimistic about the perspective of democracy. It is against the natural order for the many to govern and the few to be governed, he wrote. It is unimaginable that the people should remain continually assailed to devote their time to public affairs, adopting a view common among critics of democracy in his time. Bristol also held that there is no government subject to civil wars and instant in a way as democratic or popular governments. In a much thought passage, he declares that where their people goes, their government would be democratic. So perfect a government is not for man. Despite these negative conclusions, Russell hints in a brief footnote in his book that democratic government may be viable if joined together in a way that confederations. Some years later, in a discussion of how the people of Poland, for example, govern themselves, he allowed that there is simply no alternative way to government by representation. However, he left the problem of the proper size or scale for democratic political associations largely unsolved. So, in spite that he in a way that admitted the representation as kind of a solution, he's still unaware, or he didn't actually offer a solution for the scale of representation and the size and the privilege of these political associations in a way. Now let's talk about Mel. Mel is one of the most also important theories and now politicians. In his work on liberty, Stuart Mill argued on utilitarianism grounds that individual liberty cannot be legitimately infringed, whether by government, society, or individuals, except in cases where the individual's action would cause harm to others. In a celebrated formulation of his principles, Mill wrote the following: the sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others, his own good, either physical, moral, or any other aspects definitely of harmful, is not a sufficient warrant. So, according to him, it is a way to create balance between liberty and the community interest and the community liberty. It is a way to creating this balance between all these aspects together. Mill's principles provide a philosophical foundation for some of the basic freedoms essential to functioning democracy, such as freedom of association, such as ideal and representative democracy, for example, and undermine the legitimacy of other laws, for example, like paternalistic law, such as those requiring temperance, which in Mel's view treated adult citizens like childhood or like kids. And the area of what he called the liberty of thought and decision, another freedom crucial to democracy, Mill argued, also on utilitarian grounds that legal restrictions on the expression of opinion are never justified. The collision of adverse opinion, he contended, is a necessary part of any society's search for the truth. In another work for him, called The Considerations on Representatives' Government, Mel set forth in a lucid and very straight manner many of the essential features of the new type of government, which he had not yet emerged in continental Europe and was still incomplete in important respects and perspective in the United States by that time. In this work, he also advanced a powerful argument on behalf of women's suffrage, a position that virtually all previous political philosophers, all of them male, of course, had ignored or rejected the importance of talking about women, or at least representing women in that sense. Another important philosopher we need to talk about is Dewo. Dewo also is a very important philosopher and politician that we need to talk about. According to Dewo, who is an American philosopher, John Dewo is a very important, actually, philosopher and thinker. According to him, democracy is the most desirable form of government because it alone provides the kinds of freedom necessary for individual self-development and growth, including the freedom to exchange ideas and opinions with others, the freedom to form associations with others, to pursue common goals, and the freedom to determine and pursue one's own conceptions of the good life. Democracy is more than merely a form of government. However, there were remarks on democracy and education, one of his very important remarkable books. It is also a mode of associated life in which citizens cooperate with each other to solve their common problems through rational means, through, for example, critical inquiry and experiment, and a spirit of mutual respect and goodwill. Moreover, the political institutions of any democracy, according to Dewey, should not be viewed as the perfect and unchangeable creations of the general statements of the past. Rather, they should be constantly subject to criticism and improvement as historical circumstances and the public interest changed. So Dewey is one of these philosophers who started to talk about how to change, how to create a new type and pattern of democracy and government. Participation in a democracy, as they will conceive requires critical and very important habits of mankind and of mind. Uh, According to him, it is very important to work on a cooperation with others and a feeling of public spiritual context, a desire to achieve the common goal as part of this community together. Because these habits and attitudes must be included and inculcated from a young age, Dewey placed great emphasis on education. Indeed, he called public schools the church of democracy. So, church of democracy represents schools to Dewey. His contribution to both the theory and practice of education were numerously influenced and actually reflected on the United States and 20th century later on. He's one of the most important philosophers who started talking about education as a path of change of communities. They were offered little in the way of concrete proposals regarding the form that democratic institutions should take. Nevertheless, in the public and its problems, the other works of him, he contended the individuals cannot develop to their fullest potential except in a social democracy or a democratic welfare state. Accordingly, he held that democracies should possess strong regulation powers. He also insists that among the most important features of a social democracy should be the right of workers to participate directly in the control of the firms in which they are employed. Um, so he is not talking about the political structure and a separation from the other aspects of life, and this is actually one of the most remarkable issues of Dewey, because he started to talk about women, education, workers, labor market, and he was saying that all these aspects are working together to shape the new type of democracy as we wanted to have, as we wanted to see. So the right of workers, the education, the concept of church of democracy, all these features created his perspective of democracy. Again, talking more about DeWoz, because he's one of the most recent and the most important who actually reflected his work strongly, especially in the United States track of democratic development. Given DeWo's interest in education, it is not surprising that he was greatly concerned with the question of how citizens might better understand public affairs. Although he was a proponent of the application of the social science to the development of public policy, he sharply criticized intellectuals, academics, and political leaders who viewed the general public as incompetent and who often argued for some form of democratic elitism. Only the public, he maintained, can decide what the public interest is. In order for citizens to be able to make informed and reasonable decisions about their common problems, he thought it is important for them to engage in dialogue with each other in their local communities. There was emphasis on dialogue as a critical practice in a democracy inspired later political theorists to explore the vital role of deliberation and democratic system. Okay, and in comparison to all what we said before, uh, we face the term ideal democracy. A noted issue that many theorists, and we can see this term actually in a lot of theories and literature. As noted above, Aristotle found it useful to classify actually existing governments in terms of three ideal constitutions. For essentially the same reason, the nation of an ideal democracy also can be useful for identifying, classifying, and understanding the democratic characteristics of actually existing governments, systems, regimes, be they of city-states, nation-states, or larger associations. It is important to know that the term ideal is ambiguous actually. In one sense, a system is ideal if it is considered apart from or in the absence of certain empirical conditions, which in actuality are always present to some degree. Ideal systems, in this sense, are used to identify what features of an actual system are essential to it, or what underlying laws are representable and reasonable and responsible, and combining with empirical factors for a system's behavior in actual circumstances. In another sense, a system is ideal if it is best from a moral point of view. An ideal system, in this sense, is a goal toward which a person or a society ought to strive, even if it's not perfectly attainable in practice, actually, and a standard against which the moral worth of what has been achieved or of what exists can be measured. These two senses are often confused, and confusing all the theories, all people who do study politics. Systems that are ideal in the first sense may but need not be ideal in the second sense. Accordingly, a description of an ideal democracy, such as the one below, for example, need not to be intended to a perspective or to be prescribe a particular political system. Indeed, influent concepts of ideal democracy have been offered by democracy's enemies as well as by its own friends. Uh, by the end of this lecture, all what I want you to understand, all what I want you to see by the different perspectives, by the authors, the philosophers who started to talk about political science, it is a puzzle, or it is a picture that each of these philosophers added his own particular participation. In the end of the day, the entire image of democracy is still in shape. It's still shaping based on the perspective, social context, economic context, and all these efforts is only uh, a try to build a democratic communities. So the only fact in this, there is no pure democratic community to establish. There are huge perspectives reflecting each author, each philosopher point of view. Thank you so much for joining me in this lecture. See you in our coming lecture together. Be safe. Thanks.